So let me welcome you to this session. We've got Kishore Mahbubani, who's written this really remarkable book, which I've had the pleasure to read. And let me tell you, it's a very candid and a very frank story of, he titles it the Living the Asian Century. Now, Kishore is a great political thinker. He's an intellectual. He's been a diplomat. And more than anything else, he's been probably the greatest ambassador of globalization, multilateralism, and of Asia. So I don't think anybody who's spoken with greater conviction and greater vision and foresight on the Asia century than Kishore. So Kishore, let me start off with, while Asia was sleeping yesterday night, Trump imposed 25% duty on tariffs from Canada and from Mexico and 10% on China. What are the implications for this on global trade and on globalization?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for that very generous welcome. I'm happy to be here at the Jaipur Literature Festival. I want to begin by saying that Trump is creating one of the most dangerous moments in world history for us. And let me explain why. Because clearly, what's happening in the world structurally is that the world is shrinking. We're becoming a small, interdependent world. We're becoming literally a global village. And in a global village, you need global village councils and global village rules. So at a time when structurally humanity should be working to strengthen the global order, here comes Donald Trump, wrecker number one of the world order. So in that sense, it's going to be a dangerous moment. And what makes it worse is that there is no other power around that is strong enough to try and moderate Trump. I mean, in the past, when it came to multilateralism, the European Union, for example, would have been a healthy counterbalance to Donald Trump and said, hey, we believe in a rules-based order, you must obey the rules-based order. But as you know, the European Union is in a deep funk, okay? They are seriously lost. Let me give you one surprising, stunning statistic. In the decade 2010 to 2020, ASEAN from Southeast Asia added more to global economic growth, even though ASEAN is 1/5 the size of European Union, than the European Union did. That's how the world is changing. But having said that, I want to balance what I just said by saying that Trump is not completely mad. There is often a method to his madness that sometimes he probes, like Lenin said, you march with a bayonet. If you encounter straw, you proceed. If you encounter steel, you withdraw. So that's what Trump will do. He'll try to bully, cajole, and if he succeeds, he'll keep going. But if he gets pushed back, he may turn around. And just to give you one small example, but a very critical example of how Trump can make a positive difference. As you know, the Biden administration was trying for I don't know how long to try and get a ceasefire in Gaza. Every day we were watching people dying in Gaza, and we were wondering who's going to stop this war, who's going to stop this war. And guess what? Donald Trump did it in one day. So clearly, in that sense, he's not completely mad. Sometimes he can do positive things with his power.
Wonderful. So Kishore, tell me, in today's world, the United Nations is totally non-functional. The Security Council is dysfunctional. You've been the ambassador of Singapore to United Nations and probably been one of the most articulate spokespersons for globalization. Now, we in India very strongly feel that the Security Council needs to be reconfigured because when the multilateral institutions were started, there was no climate change issue. There was no challenge of climate action. There was no challenge of security, of sustainable development goals. So how do we make Security Council functional? And India today, which is the fifth largest economy in the world, how does it play a far more critical role?
Well, I think it's very clear that the time for India to join the UN Security Council as a permanent member has arrived. And as some of you may know, I published an article in the Financial Times in August last year suggesting that the one generous gesture that the government of the United Kingdom could do is that to compensate India for the years of colonial rule is to give up its permanent seat in the UN Security Council to India. And this is, by the way, this is not a frivolous suggestion, because at the end of the day, when UK joined the Security Council in 1945, there was no question that, UK was one of the great powers of the world. And, at the end of World War II, China, India combined had about 5% share of the global GNP. So China and India had become very small. And the British were all very strong and powerful. But over the last 80 years, there has been a fundamental transformation of global power, and the rising powers are in Asia. And clearly, a Security Council that doesn't include India is not a functional Security Council. But I want to emphasize that reforming the UN Security Council is very difficult, because for every new member that wants to join, there's a neighbor that says, why not me? For Brazil that wants to join, Argentina says, why not me? For Japan that wants to join, South Korea says, why not me? And as you know, in South Asia, when India tries to join, Pakistan says, why not me? But the guy who said it the best in the UN, I remember, was the Italian ambassador to the UN in the 1980s. He said, why is everybody pushing only for Germany and Japan to join the UN Security Council? He said, we Italy, we lost World War II also. So we qualify. It's a true story. But you see, it indicates that there's jealousy, which is why very quickly I want to mention, I wrote a book called The Great Convergence, which I saw very happily in the bookstore here, proposing a 777 formula, which I can't explain now. 7 permanent members, 7 semi-permanent members to accommodate the losers, the Pakistan, South Koreas, Argentinas. They become semi-permanent members, and then 7 elected members. So there are ways and means. And the Quincy Institute in Washington, D.C. has taken up my 777 proposal and is seeing whether they can adapt it and change the Security Council.
Thanks. Kishore, I wanted to turn to Singapore. And, my belief is that Singapore's transformation has been one of the most incredible transformations the world has seen. It's been on account of some really outstanding leadership of Singapore. What would you like to tell the audience here about what kind of political leadership that existed in Singapore, and what can India do to have great political leaders like that, who really transformed a city-state into such a great country?
Well, you're right. As I explained in my memoirs, Living the Asian Century, when Singapore became independent, Singapore was a very poor country. Our per capita income was only $500, the same as Ghana in Africa. Today, for your information, is $90,000. It's among the top 5 in the world, I think. It's a remarkable transformation of Singapore. And it's due...
So from 5,000 to 90...
500.
From 500 to 90,000 per capita income.
Per capita income.
Phenomenal.
By the way, no other country has accomplished this. In fact, I do argue, with some facts and evidence, that Singapore is the most successful society since human history began, because no other society has improved the living standards of its people as quickly and as comprehensively as Singapore has done so in one lifetime. One lifetime, which is amazing. Because, the Industrial Revolution took 200 years, right? We did it in one lifetime. But the reason why Singapore succeeded exceptionally is because we had several exceptional leaders. Now, most of you would have heard of Lee Kuan Yew, But I can tell you it was not a one-man show. It was not one man that was responsible for the success of Singapore. He was surrounded by a brilliant team. And in my memoirs, I describe especially the contributions of Dr. Goh Keng Swee, who was the architect of the Singapore's economic miracle, and Mr. Rajaratnam, who was Singapore's foreign minister for a long time. And these people were, number one, geopolitical geniuses. They knew how to manipulate the international geopolitical scene, and at the same time, they were ruthlessly realistic. And if Singapore had to cooperate with the devil to move ahead, Singapore would cooperate with the devil. I'm not exaggerating. So, for example, in the 1960s and 70s, when most developing countries were rejecting foreign investment, they said American multinational corporations are exploitative, they are robbing your country, they're bad for you. We said no. American multinational corporations come in. First, they create jobs. Second, they hand over management expertise. Third, they bring markets. Fourth, they bring capital. So why not welcome them? And one of the most shocking statistics, as you know, the economies of China, what is it, 17, 18 trillion, what, Japan, like 4 trillion, South Korea, 1.5 trillion. You know, these combined economies are so much bigger than Singapore, but Singapore has received more American investment than China, Japan, South Korea combined. In a country that is only 700 square kilometers, right? Now, that's an example of how we are prepared to do anything. And the real thing, the real remarkable thing about Singapore is that it always went against conventional wisdom. When it tried to move ahead, it didn't care what was the conventional opinion, what was the popular opinion. It worked on what would be good for the Singapore people, and if it would be good for the Singapore people, we would do it.
So, Kishore, while this transformation has been incredible, many critics in the Western part of the world say that this Singapore transformation came at the cost of individual freedom and by crushing any kind of dissent. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I can tell you that when I was ambassador in New York for over 10.5 years, I would have constant arguments with my American friends, and, there's some basic facts about Singapore that many of them are not aware of. So every 5 years, there are elections in Singapore, and the people choose the government. The government is not imposed on the people. And if President Jimmy Carter had sent in 10,000 election observers, the People's Action Party would have still won the election. Because, if you as a people have benefited so much, your per capita income goes from 500 to 90,000, why do you want to vote out the government that has delivered this to you? And, when the Americans were criticizing us, and sometimes we would acknowledge that some of the criticisms were fair, our press is not as free as the press in America, for example. But at the same time, I remember distinctly the United States used to accuse Singapore of beating up prisoners and torturing prisoners. But what's amazing is that after all those decades of criticism of Singapore, the first modern developed country to reintroduce torture was the United States of America. So the United States was saying, hey, Singapore, don't torture. But in the torture in Guantanamo, the water torture is much worse than beating up anybody. Much, much worse. You feel you're dying when you're being subjected to water torture. So one would assume that after the United States had begun torturing people, it would stop criticizing Singapore. One of the great mysteries in my life is that I can't figure out why the United States is still criticizing Singapore when they themselves are not living up to their own human rights standards. And sadly, I find that the Europeans, again, have let down their American friends by telling them that if you are preaching there should be no torture, you got to make sure you don't carry out torture yourself.
Thank you. Thanks. Kishore, I wanted to come back to this wonderful book that you've written. And I read every word and every letter. It's a very, very inspirational book. And I'd request all those sitting here to pick up this book and read it. It speaks volumes about Kishore, because you come from a very Sindhi background, and you came from abject poverty, a very, very miserable background, and you've risen to the pinnacles of the world of diplomacy. What was it like growing up in the Singapore of those days, and what enabled you to rise to such heights and such glory? What was it in the air of Singapore that made you such a great diplomat?
Thank you. I should give you a flavor of what my childhood was like. Literally, I came from a very poor family in a poor Singapore. At the age of 6 months, the doctors told my mother, "Your son is going to die of diarrhea. He's not going to make it." Somehow or other, I survived. At the age of 6 years, when I went to school, I was put on a special feeding program because I was technically undernourished. Now, as you can see, I'm overnourished. And then, of course, I lived in a house without a flush toilet. And my father used to get involved. He unfortunately lost his parents early. He wasn't brought up well. So he used to drink, smoke, gamble. And in the book, I recount scenes of going to a coffee shop across my house to go and pick up my father, who was standing there with 2 broken beer bottles after a big fight with somebody. And since my father used to gamble and lose money, we would get Chinese gangsters coming to our house to try and collect money, and my father would roll under the bed, and then I would tell the gangsters, no, he's not home, he's not home. Now, I describe this, as you know, with great detail to explain that actually, when you come from such tough circumstances, it is not necessarily a liability. It can be an asset. It can create strengths of resilience in you. And in my case, the reason why you asked why was I so successful, I think there were a couple of lucky accidents in my life. The first lucky accident is that by chance, a childhood friend of mine and I, just by chance, because we grew up in a house with no books at all, but by chance, this childhood friend of mine discovered a neighborhood library. And so we started going to the library 3-4 times a week, reading books every day. That magical discovery transformed my life. And then as a result of that, after I finished high school, I started working as a Sindhi textile salesman, earning $150 a month selling textiles. And then out of the blue, I got a letter from the Public Service Commission saying you received the President's Scholarship, and the President's Scholarship will give you $250 a month. So my mother said, $250 is more than $150, you go to university. So that's how I didn't become a textile salesman. Of course, it's possible that I could have been a very successful Sindhi businessman and not a diplomat. But I can assure you, by the way, just I want to emphasize that I have done exceptionally well. And I sometimes tell my friends, when I grew up, there were 6 of us staying in a 1-bedroom house. Now there are 2 of us living in a 6-bedroom house.
So you've been a great entrepreneurial diplomat, and tell me, was this because of Singapore, or was this because you were a Sindhi boy?
Well, I think it's an interesting question, because the Economist magazine once wrote a column about me, and the first line was, "For a diplomat, Kishore Mahbubani is refreshingly rude." So I think I took that as a compliment. And it's hard to figure out how I ended up being so iconoclastic and challenging conventional wisdom. But I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that I majored in philosophy.
Okay.
And as I explain in my memoirs, studying Western philosophy taught me to ask all kinds of fundamental questions in a way that nothing else could have taught me. I should have done a more practical subject like economics, but I found it very boring. I ended up studying philosophy both at the National University of Singapore and at Dalhousie University. And as a result of that, I also began to write a great deal. So it's very unusual for a diplomat to have published 10 books and after retirement. So it shows you that I have a passion for writing and speaking out that has held me in good stead.
So, you know, one thing that I discovered from this undiplomatic memoir is that you keep writing great books because you listen to Muhammad Rafi and Kishore Kumar and Lata Mangeshkar. What is it that inspires you from Bollywood music?
Well, I think that's a good question. I mean, I should emphasize it's Muhammad Rafi, Kishore Kumar, Lata Mangeshkar, Asha Bhosle, all the songs I used to listen as a child. And I can tell you that when I listen to music that I heard when I was a child, I believe that somehow or other my childhood neurons in my brain are being reignited. And it's bizarre. If I don't listen to Muhammad Rafi and the four of them, I cannot write. It's impossible. So it is therefore I think it's the association with the curiosity of a young mind that comes alive when I listen to this music.
And who's your favorite?
Well, I think I would say Muhammad Rafi.
Yeah?
For
And do you
sure.
sing yourself?
If I started singing, all of you would run away. I'm a very, very bad singer. It's important in life to know what your talents are. And I've been successful in the writings. And I was going to mention, actually, I told Amitabh this story just before this book came out, Living the Asian Century. My ninth book was a free book, open access book, published by a German publisher, Springer Nature. It's free. You can download it for free. So when I asked the German publisher, Stefan von Holzbring, what's your target? How many downloads do you want to try to get for this free book? And they said if you get 20,000 downloads, it'll be a very good result. But instead of 20,000 downloads, there have been 3.99 million downloads in 160 countries. So it shows you that when you sit down and you write, and if you write with deep conviction, and you write in a way that adds value to people who find that they're getting a perspective that they cannot obviously get. And clearly, the Western media refuses to use the two words Asian century. They refuse to use the words. They still believe in one way or another that the West will continue to dominate world history. But it's now very clear that we are reaching the end of the era of Western domination of world history, but not the end of the West. I must emphasize, the end of the era of Western domination is not the end of the West. The West remains a strong, powerful, resourceful, resilient civilization. But the West has now got to learn to share space with other civilizations. And that's why I say you're also seeing the return of Asia. And I find it heartening that many Asians find that as a result of reading what I write, they take greater pride in themselves and in their own culture and in their own history and in their own background. And I think as we rediscover Asian history, we will become to realize that in many ways, we had created societies as great as the West long before the West had done so. So this is something we're going to go through, a period of Asians rediscovering themselves, and that's what I'm trying to contribute with my writings.
So, Kishore, as you rightly said, you've been an outspoken advocate of the Asian century. And, but, you know, I find that there are regional tensions within Asia. And there are huge conflicts within Asia itself. So how does, what are the challenges and opportunity, and what can Asia do together to make this an Asia century? And, you know, if your vision of the Asia century, then how do we really tap into this world of opportunities when there are global tensions?
Well, you're right. I mean, nothing in life is a straight road. There are always ups and downs. And as you know, I mean, my memoirs and my life story, I say I went up, I went down, I went up, I went down. So I went up, went down many times, but I was lucky each time I bounced back up.
So what's the secret of you always bouncing back in such a big way?
I think, as I explained in my book, I credit this to my mother, because my mother had arrived in Singapore as an relatively uneducated. She had a close shave, leaving Pakistan as a Hindu Sindhi woman. She could have been killed in those riots that took place in 47. She had actually a very close shave, but she survived, and I was born in Singapore after that. But when I watched my mother go through all these struggles, I told myself, if my mother never broke down once with all the challenges that she was facing from a husband that wasn't earning money and from having the struggle to feed the family, if she didn't break down, how could I break down? So I think the resilience comes from her. But going back to Asia, your first question, you know, it's important to emphasize that if you look at East Asia, many of the Americans had said long time ago that when the Cold War ended, Asia's future will be Europe's past. That you would see the big wars being fought in Asia and not being fought in Europe, because Europe had achieved nirvana with the end of history in 1990. But as you know, since 1990, there have been no major wars in Asia. None. It's shocking. There's been no major war in Asia since 1979, 46 years. By contrast, the biggest wars, interstate wars, have been fought on the fringes of Europe. You have the Yugoslav wars, you have the wars in Caucasus, you have the Ukraine war. So this is something that insufficient credit is given to Asian countries for having delivered a long peace over 45 years. Now, this doesn't mean that there aren't geopolitical rivalries. There are geopolitical rivalries, there are geopolitical tensions, there are just geopolitical rivalries within China and Japan, within Vietnam and China to some extent, and certainly the China-India relationship is a challenging relationship. So we have lots of challenges. But the critical thing is, are you able to manage these challenges in such a way that you avoid a war? That's the critical thing. And that's something, for some strange reason, we've been very good at in doing in Asia. And I would say that all of you should maybe give a bit of credit to an organization called ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, because ASEAN convenes meetings of all the Asian leaders every year. And at these meetings, the Asian leaders can talk to each other. I'll give you one example. In the 1990s, China and Japan had a quarrel, something about World War II. And the leaders couldn't meet, right? They couldn't have a bilateral meeting. So they had to find a face-saving way of meeting each other. So what did they do? They came to an ASEAN meeting, and then they had breakfast together under the hospitality of ASEAN. So ASEAN has played the role of being like a diplomatic lubricant, providing opportunities for Asian countries to continually interact with one another. So the long peace that you have seen in ASEAN, which is unusual in East Asia, is a result of what ASEAN has contributed.
Kishore, I'm going to open up this session to some questions from the audience. And those of you who are interested in asking, and you're most welcome to grill Kishore. He's got away lightly from me. So please use this opportunity to ask him some tough questions. But my only request is that while you ask these tough questions, don't start giving a parallel presentation. Just make very tough, tight questions. Just ask a very firm, clear question. So I'll start with this young lady sitting here in pink.
Good evening, sir. My question to you is, you spoke about how Singapore is developed, in such a little span of time, and you've evolved and you've transformed the country. But Singapore seems to be one of those few countries which still believes in capital punishment. So, do you have any comments on such an extreme measure of punishments that you all follow? Yeah.
Yeah, a very, very good question. And I should explain why the government says it still needs the death penalty. Singapore's total trade, this is unusual. If you look at all the 193 members of the UN, the country with the largest amount of trade as a percentage of GNP is Singapore. Our total trade is 3.5 times the size of our GNP. So Singapore port, Singapore airport, you have sort of millions of tons of stuff going through every minute, every second. So we could easily become a drug trafficking entrepot. So to make sure that we don't become a drug trafficking entrepot, we have very severe penalties for drug trafficking. And it is used very carefully, by the way. And the judicial system in Singapore is extremely rigorous. And I can tell you that the judges in Singapore is acknowledged among the best in the world. And this is I don't know whether you all know this, is sort of it's a sort of well-known secret that the Singapore civil service is the best paid civil service in the world. The top civil servants can make $1 million a year. So as a reason I mentioned that is that the quality of mind of people serving in the government, therefore, is among the highest in the world, including the judges. So we have a very robust judicial system to make sure that the death penalty is not abused in any way.
I'm going to come to all the men here who are raising their hands. There's this young girl sitting there, very young girl.
Hello, sir. I'm Pranjal from Jaipur MGD Girls School. So, sir, my question is that, sir, you just told about that how tough times did you have with your father and the problem. Like, it's impossible to see your mother in such a trouble. So, how did you mentally recover? Like, how did you think of doing such a great thing? Like, I am like confused. For example, if we take small thing in student life, we have this homework problem, we get tensed in that. So yours is like 10,000 times much more problem. How did you cope up with that?
That's
Before Kishore answers that, I must say it's a very good question because, his book brings this in great details. His father was a drunkard. He used to vanish away. He's written it with great candor, Kishore. I complimented Kishore on this, that he's written about his background. His father used to drink, and he used to vanish, and he used to get into street brawls, etc. And his mother actually managed everything. So it's all of you must read this book to understand that from what kind of a background in abject poverty and misery, Kishore grew into one of the greatest diplomats. So Kishore, over to you.
Yes, I mean that's a very good question, and I can tell you, by the way, that at the time when I was experiencing the traumas, it wasn't easy. For example, when Chinese gangsters come to your house and say, "Where's your father?" knowing that they'll beat up my father, knowing my father is hiding under a bed, and I have to tell them, no, he's not home, and so on and so forth. And then sometimes we will get debt collectors coming to our house to paste notices on the front door saying nothing in this house can be removed because everything in this house will be auctioned to pay off the debts of my father, Mr. Mohandas Mahbubani. So I can tell you that when you were going through these things, it wasn't easy. I remember going to pick up my father when he was drunk, lying in a storm drain, and I had to pick him up and bring him home. I had to also go and visit him in jail when he went to jail. So these things are traumatic. But at the end of the day, if you can overcome that, then it creates a resilience. Because, I've gone, you see, if you read this book, that I describe quite candidly how my career would plunge after going up, And then I would hit the depths of despair, but then I would tell myself, I'm much better off than when I was as a child, so what am I complaining about, right? So that hardship can create a tremendous amount of resilience. But having said that, I must be fair, I've also seen how some people with the same hardship crumble. So I tell a story about a classmate of mine in secondary one, so 13 years old. And he also had a father who was struggling, couldn't get a job. He had a mother like me. He had 3 sisters. They couldn't get the money to pay for all their bills. This 13-year-old boy got so distressed, he decided to hang himself. So when you go through these traumas, you can break down.
Here, this side, this gentleman here first.
Thank you, Kishore, for being an inspiration not only for the kids, but for those of us in the MDB and the multilateral community. Just one quick question. Why aren't you more sanguine about Trump? He may end up actually accelerating your theory with the fact that the recession from the US or receding from the world stage might actually give more impetus to the Asian powers to come in and take up the mantle.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. I was uncharacteristically being very restrained. Since that was my opening question, I thought I shouldn't heat up the audience too much in my first response. But I mean, to be honest with you, if you're sitting in Beijing, you'll probably look at Trump and you think that this is a gift that will keep on giving. Because Trump is alienating so many countries, you know. Normally, most American presidents, like Biden, for example, went after America's adversaries or competitors and hugged their allies. Whereas Trump is doing the exact opposite. He's kicking the allies and in some cases actually hugging the adversaries. So in that sense, it's not yet clear whether Trump understands the long-term consequences of what he's doing. Now, the thing about Donald Trump is that he's a very complex man who's difficult to understand. As I said, he's not completely mad. I suspect he wants to kick Canada and Mexico to send a signal to everybody. Listen, if I can kick Canada and Mexico, I can kick any country in the world. So don't think you're immune to me. And he wants them to bend in one way or another, declare victory and say, okay, you're next if you don't comply like Canada. But in the process, of course, certainly he's going to alienate a lot of countries. And you know, as you know, there's a Harvard professor called Joe Nye, a friend of mine, good friend of mine. He's written about American soft power. And it's true that America, by the way, America today still has a lot of soft power. And I always emphasize, whatever you do, never underestimate the United States as a society. It's a remarkably strong, robust society. I never write off the United States, never. But at the same time, it's also a fact that Trump can do a lot of damage. And frankly, at the end of 4 years, I think China will have more friends and Trump will have less friends. I mean, depending on how he plays the game at the end, because Trump can switch from being your total adversary, threatening North Korea with complete oblivion, and then he can hug Kim Jong-un. So, you know, he can do anything. And one other fact I would like to mention is that what's unusual about Donald Trump is that the one thing he wants to get is the Nobel Peace Prize. Because he says, if Obama got it, why shouldn't I get it? So if he wants to go after the Nobel Peace Prize, and if he brings peace, let's say for the Palestinians, then we should thank him for it.
Thank you. The gentleman at the back with specs there. Yeah, you're raising your hand, please.
Yeah.
Please.
So my question is not what can India learn from Singapore, but why doesn't it learn from Singapore? China did spectacularly in the 1980s with Deng Xiaoping.
Well, I think you're right, by the way. You were implying in your question that China had learned from Singapore, and that's a fact, because after the architect of Singapore's economic miracle was Dr. Goh Keng Swee, not Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew contributed too. And so Dr. Goh Keng Swee then went to advise Mr. Deng Xiaoping and the Chinese leaders after he stepped down. But as to why India is not listening, I think that's not a question I can answer. I think it's a question that Indians have to answer. But I must emphasize, though, that India and Singapore have excellent relations. In my memoirs, I explained that, our former Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong tried to create an India fever in Singapore to get Singaporeans to know more about India and do more with India. So we're definitely trying to step up our ties with India.
And the Singapore leadership, the Prime Minister of India has a very close relationship with the Singapore leadership in particular. Um the lady here.
Do you think the success of Singapore has to do with people's mentality, the citizenship's mentality, or just that it was small in number?
Sorry, what's the second part of the question? Just that.
Singapore was a very small country with less people
Oh,
compared
less
to
people.
India.
Oh, I
Yeah.
see. Well, I think Singapore's, by the way, I have, just to be very quick, I have given away the secret of Singapore's success. It's called the MPH formula. MPH doesn't stand for miles per hour. MPH stands for meritocracy, pragmatism, honesty. And I believe that any country that applies MPH can do very, very well. And so that's what Singapore has done, It's picked the best people to be in government. Singapore is the best copycat country in the world. Dr. Goh Keng Swee told me that no matter what problem Singapore encounters, somebody somewhere has encountered it. There's no such thing as a new problem. No such thing. Somebody somewhere has encountered the problem, somebody somewhere has solved it. Why don't we go and study how they solved it and adapt it for us? So Singapore is the best copycat country in the world. And honesty is the hardest one. We have zero corruption. And that's the hardest. What makes it harder for most countries to succeed, frankly, in most third world countries is corruption. And Singapore has managed to achieve almost zero corruption.
The young lady there raising the hand. Yeah.
Hi, so I have a three-layered question. Basically, in the Asian century that you're talking about, we have a pressure of climate vulnerabilities which are disproportionately going to be borne by
Can you be a little louder and speak in the mic?
There's a disproportionate cost of climate change that is borne by Asian countries. And we have a trade dependence, as you were just mentioning, which is again significant with the West. And then underpinning all of this is the US dollar, which again makes us sort of very sensitive to changes. So in that realm, how do you see the Asian century really unfolding, and what is required to actually decouple the challenges of these dependencies?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, there are other problems. I mean, we can't cover everything. And climate change, I think Amitabh is an expert, as you know, is going to be a big challenge for humanity. And if I ever could have a private moment with Donald Trump, I would tell Donald Trump in private, I said, don't you get the lessons of the fires from Hollywood? You saw the fires in Hollywood. You have these homes that are worth $60 million, $100 million. What happens? When the forest catches fire, your house burns. So we have created a global interdependency. So global warming means you're not safe anywhere. So the lesson for the United States and for all of us is that we must work together to combat climate change. And I would say overall, the Asian countries are still behaving responsibly in terms of meeting their commitments. None of us have left the Paris Climate Accords, whereas Trump is leaving it again, I believe, the Paris Climate Accords. So we have to try and persuade Donald Trump on issues like climate change. But as we continue growing, we have to watch the environmental dimension too.
So we'll have, even the lights are now going off. It's about 6:25, but it's been a wonderful interaction with Kishore. So I want to have last two questions by people at the back. The frontliners have had it. So those two hands being raised there.
As Singapore is an ASEAN country, what do you think that China has more influence over ASEAN nations or India? Just now you said that India is a very good friend of Singapore. So what do you think? And in reality, just give us a honest opinion of yours.
Yeah.
As China has major
Okay.
influence over Asia.
Okay, fine. Any other question? The second one there and this lady there. 3 questions. The lady there. Yeah.
Hello, sir. So, with your decades of experience in diplomacy, I'd like to understand in retrospect, what do you think? Does the means matter as much as the ends? Or sometimes the long term consequences of means kind of backfire?
Okay, thank you. Well, I mean, we have very little time. We have 29.
One more question, and that's it.
Hello, sir. My question is for the success of the 18th century to flourish, how the relationship between India and China will play out in the future. Thank you.
Okay.
So
well,
all three good questions.
Excellent.
And I think all 3 questions put Kishore on a mat. So Kishore, over to you.
Okay, the first question, I would say certainly China's trade with ASEAN is much larger than India's trade with ASEAN. In the year 2022 is almost $1 trillion in trade. But at the same time, I can tell you that the ASEAN countries do not want to be dependent completely on one country. They want to hedge their bets, and they want to certainly do more with India. And as you know, if you look at the history of Southeast Asia, over the past 2,000 years, 9 out of the 10 countries in Southeast Asia have an Indic influence. Only 1 has a Sinic influence. So India's traditional space in Southeast Asia has always been very, very strong. The second question on means and ends, I would say if you read my book, one thing I try to describe quite honestly to all of you is that one reason why Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was so successful is that he had studied Machiavelli very well. And my advice to any policy maker is you have to understand Machiavelli, because geopolitics is a very cruel and dangerous business. It kills people who are naive, absolutely kills them. And countries get into trouble when they become naive. So you must learn to be as cold and calculating and unemotional when you get involved in geopolitics. And finally, on the relations with China and India is the most important relationship in Asia. All of us in the rest of Asia want to see good relations between China and India. But even if you can't get good relations, at least have a stable and predictable relationship that doesn't rock the boat. And in this regard, I must say, the recent developments have been very, very encouraging, because at the end of the day, if you want to develop economically, you also got to be very brutal and calculating. As I said, if you need to cooperate with the devil to succeed, you cooperate with the devil to succeed. So in many ways, cooperate with any countries which will add value to your economy, and don't hold back. So there are ways and means of creating win-win scenarios for both China and India.
Has Kishore responded to the third question? Yes. Okay. So all of them has been responded to. So we'll take one last final question. Any ladies here? Any lady here? Yeah, please. And ask a really tough one, huh?
Thank you for the opportunity to ask the question. My question is not tough, but it's what I've been wanting to know for a long time.
Hold the mic closer.
Yeah, sorry. So, India is in a very unique and diverse position, so it's very unfair to compare it to our, say, Asian neighbors or West in toto. So, what is the closest country or region that comes whose pathway to development we can actually follow? And not just take random bits and pieces from here and there which are not suitable to our economy or our path of development.
Well, you're absolutely right. Every country is unique. Every country has challenges, and certainly India is unique and has its own challenges. But if you look at all the successful countries in Asia, the way they succeeded is by learning from others. And I can tell you, in the case of Singapore, we learned from Japan. And where did Japan learn from? When Japan had the Meiji Restoration in the 1860s, the Japanese asked themselves a very simple question. 1860s, why has India collapsed under British rule? Why is China being humiliated in the Opium War? We'll be next. So how did Japan prevent a collapse? Japan went out to learn from the rest of the world. So it learned how to build a navy from the British. It learned how to build an army from the Germans. It learned how to develop a Napoleonic code from the French. It learned how to develop a modern economy from United States. So, every country can learn from other countries, but you have to adapt it to your situation. And what I find very strange is that it is so easy to learn from the rest of the world. That's what Singapore has been doing. And even now, Singapore is still learning from the rest of the world. So I would say that the best thing that India could do is to go out and study why other countries have succeeded. Don't take the formula wholesale, but take elements that might work and put it together, and the results can be spectacular. So India's per capita income should definitely be much higher than what it is today. And if you look at just one last statistic, the most competitive human laboratory in the world is the United States of America. The bright people from all over the world go to compete in the United States and America. Which ethnic group has the highest per capita income in the United States? It's the Indian community. So what it shows is that Indians are naturally competitive. If you want India to succeed, increase the competition, and then India will take off.
Thank you. So this has been a remarkable session, and Kishore, you've been truly awesome. I must say it's been really fascinating. It's been a huge learning process, and it's 6:30. The lights are going off, but you've still managed to retain all the audience. Thank you very much. Let me just tell you that I've read this book. It's a truly outstanding book. It's a fascinating memoir, and it's a book which from which I've learned enormously. So from his life, from his experiences, and from his being a great intellectual and a great political thinker and a great diplomat. It's been a great learning process, and I would request all of you to buy this book, and Kishore will be very happy to sign the book while he's here after this session. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks a lot.